Right, well, I have the dubious pleasure of being able to stand here today and tell you there's more things out there that can go wrong than already are. But it's also the wrong kind of things that are interesting and tie into what I've been talking about in my two previous lectures here today. It ties into the evolutionary history of the bee and things that go wrong. And in so doing, I'm going to cover some points that I think you'll find practical and interesting. And that's where it's really kind of cool when it all comes together with practical beekeeping. Honeybees occupy a strange niche that really is not replicated anywhere else. Are they farm animals? Yes. Are they natural animals out there in the ecosystem? Yes. And that creates a lot of tension, doesn't it? Because we never really quite know where the honeybee fits. And I think you hear that in hallway conversations and how people approach things like health of the honeybee and should we treat for mites or should we not treat for mites. And these conversations don't happen in any other sector of agriculture. It just doesn't happen. So honeybees are really strange in that little niche that we occupy that I just don't know of any other comparable animal or plant like that out there. I don't know, maybe fish farming. My wife and I were in Scotland a couple of years back, and I was getting ready to speak to a beekeepers group in Newcastle, and I learned for the first time about farmed salmon off the coast of Scotland, that they keep them in these submerged cages. And surprise, surprise, there's these little salmon fleas that drop off the farmed salmon, and then when the natural salmon are coming in to do their salmon thing, you know, swimming up the rivers and all that, they catch these fleas that fall on them from the cages of salmon. And so I was sitting here thinking, there is a corollary. Yeah, salmon is probably the nearest thing I've ever heard to beekeeping, you know, where that kind of tension can happen between managed populations and feral ones. So, you know, you're really in a, you thought it was just honey, right? And you find that this animal that we work with and love so much is a real rabbit hole. It takes you down deep, deep, deep into the very foundations of biological organization on this planet. And it's at that level that this talk is talking about. Things that can go wrong that are wired into the bee. I'm going to read you this cartoon. Someone sent me this cartoon out of the blue. If it is you, please identify yourself so that I can thank you, because I've used this cartoon shamelessly ever since. And we have a knight in shining armor at the top, and he says, "My queen, I pledge my allegiance. How can I serve the kingdom?" Okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to stab our enemies using this tiny sword. I also want you to hook the sword into your internal organs. That way, when you stab someone, it rips out all of your guts and you die. Your enemy won't die, of course, but it should sting a little, and maybe they won't bother us afterward. Does this sound like a good idea to you? I hope that every one of you at some point in your life have had that conversation that kind of went like I just said, because you know what they're referring to here. It's the self-sacrificing worker bee. And she really does have a serrated sting that kind of looks like a harpoon under a microscope, and it really does stay in the flesh of her victim, and the involuntary muscles of the poison sac come ripping out with it when she flies away, and it stays there pumping its poison into your flesh, autonomous of her, while she flies away, and then she starts pinging against your veil and burrowing in your skin. Yeah, that's that defense response that we talked about this morning. And in so doing, she dies. This is a self-sacrificing act. And this is a part of that great chain of biological organization that I mentioned this morning, where levels at lower entities in the biological spectrum have to be subsumed into higher ones. Unlinked nucleotides just floating around out there, get bundled up into chromosomes, get bundled up into cells, get bundled up into multicellular organisms, get bundled up into superorganisms. And at every step of this process, the lower levels have to subsume their genetic interests to the interest of the higher entity that they've just joined to. And that is it's not an option, it's necessary. If that does not happen, then the next interval will not occur. There has to be checks and balances in place to keep the lower units in compliance to the greater unit that they've joined to. We talked about some of them this morning. In the honeybee, that is policing behavior. Remember I talked about how queens will eat the eggs of their daughters and daughters will eat the eggs of each other. And this is an effort at group level coherence. This is a way of, so what we've seen in this transition is natural selection shifting its focus from the lower group to the next higher group. And it's really bad perhaps for the lower groups, but it's really good for the higher groups because natural selection has shifted its focus to the higher group. And anytime that happens, it constitutes a new level of biological organization. And the honeybee occupies the stratum higher than us. Higher than us. Thank you, Ashley. I was in danger of winding down.
That's not pretty.
And that would not be pretty. Thank you. All right, so that's what we're talking about. That interface between multicellular organism like you and me and the superorganism occupied by the honeybee. What can go wrong? Well, the basis of all this ultimately is that most famous of replicating molecules, DNA, which is bundled together into chromosomes. You've probably seen this typical, they often look like this as a molecule. But if you were to grab one end of it and pull it out and unravel it, you'd see that that chromosome is just one really long single molecule of DNA. And you notice those little tight kinks and bends? This is an interesting, earlier in our understanding of biology, we had what we called so-called junk DNA, big long sections of DNA that seemed to have no function. We just couldn't find what they did. And we would have some areas of DNA that controlled a particular trait, and it would be 100 miles away on the chromosome from a related gene controlling the very same trait. Why are they so far apart in space? Only to find out later that those two sections touch in the bent form of the chromosome. So this is typically how our genetic information is organized in each of our cells. We talked in my last lecture how in diploid animals like you and me, where we have one set of chromosomes from our mother and one from our father, that our chromosomes occur in pairs. We call them homologs. And they tend to have the alternate forms of any particular gene. You get one from your mother, one from your father. You can line up the chromosomes for any organism, and we call these karyotypes, and they are usually ranked according to the size of the chromosome, the bigger ones down to the smaller ones, each occurring as a pair, one from your mother, one from your father. And these numbers are particular to species. Human beings, our karyotype number is 46. We get 23 from our mother, 23 from our father. The honeybee, the number is 32. They get 16 from their mother and 16 from their father. And this is distinctive of the group. Another distinctive of the Hymenoptera is the males, they have only one set of chromosomes. And that's true across the entire order. The ants and the wasps and the bees, the males always have just one set of chromosomes. So drones kind of occupy an interesting niche. They are literally, metaphorically, and literally sperm with wings. Sperm with wings. They entirely have the genomes of their mother. Their mother's, the male's eggs come from their mother entirely with no father, and it's just the recombined genes of their mother. So all of their genes only come from their mother, which makes that old ditty true that drones have grandfathers and no fathers. Okay, you can do weird things like that if you're in the order Hymenoptera, and that's the guy right there that has all this. Now what this makes is for some interesting relationships in the colony, and I alluded to some of these this morning. Don't despair, I'm not going to dwell on this particular image, but I want to make a couple points. In a diploid animal where all of us are diploid, males and females like you and me, Then that makes the rules of inheritance pretty simple. You have 50% of your genes in common with your parents, 50% of your genes in common with your siblings, and your offspring have 50% of their genes in common with you. Now, because our genes, our chromosomes, pair up together in the formation of our eggs and sperm, they share chromosomal material between the two, scramble up that DNA, and then separate again to form the respective sperm and eggs. Because of that, that's why we're not clones of one another. This is why you can look at your sibling and ask the legitimate question, are you really related to me? Like my sister has said to me. Where did you come from in the family? Because there's this recombination that happens in the very formation of our gametes. But that 50% rule applies generally with the diploid animals. In the Hymenoptera, it's quite different. Let's kind of zero in a little bit of what this means. The queens are diploid. Don't ever forget that. It's just the males that are haploid. So when the queen reproduces, her progeny are in fact 50% related, just like it would be with you and me. So that means whether she produces a daughter, female, or a male son, she's passing on 50% of her genes in either case. So she's really quite happy to produce either one, because either scenario results in 50% of her genes going on. But what if her daughter wants to reproduce? And her daughter says, you know what, this pheromone thing that my mom's got going on in the nest that's keeping my ovaries underdeveloped, I'm just going to rebel. I'm going to kind of get as far away from mom as I can and her pheromone influence. I'm going to hang out over here on the edge of the nest. And by golly, I'm going to lay eggs. And I'm not mated, but I can still lay eggs, and that means that it's going to be sons. And because I'm a diploid animal, I'm 50% related to my son, so I kind of want to do that. That would make sense. The queen on her part, however, she's not really interested in raising grandsons because she's only 25% related to them. So this is a conflict, a potential conflict early in the evolution of social insects, and it's resolved by egg policing. The earliest mothers would seek out and eat the eggs that their daughters were rearing. And very soon, if not immediately at the same time, the daughters would begin eating each other's eggs so that only the mother would have a hegemony, shall we say, in laying eggs in the colony. Now here's that unique relationship within a generation that's made possible in the Hymenoptera. Because all of the progeny share 50% of their genes in common with their mother, all of the progeny of one generation share all of their genes in common from their father, and so that makes a lopsided relatedness of sisters to sister of 75%. This is that super sister thing I was talking about this morning. Now a female to her brother is only related 25%. So what does that mean? If I am 75% related to my sisters, then that is the basis for sticking around and forming a nest. This is one of the great moments in evolution when hymenopterans were coming together and daughters were realizing more fitness if they stayed at home and helped their mother produce super sisters. And it was more profitable to her to help rear super sisters than it was to raise her own sons. And this was the earliest basis of social group formation in the Hymenoptera. Remember my joke this morning about millennials sticking around? Well, it's kind of the ultimate thing. I stick around, I share the nest that mom already made the nest. I didn't even have to build the nest. I'm going to stick around with mom and help her make these super sisters. It's a Darwinian no-brainer. And that's the basis of what I talked about this morning, how we progress from point A to B to C. We see this social glue beginning to happen, where we have these autonomous females, each rooming together, each making their own brood clump, and then by here we start seeing some separation of labor. Because we have 5 females but only 2 brood cells, that means they're starting to parse out their tasks. Incidentally, caste is not a product of evolution. This is amazing. Caste is one of those things that is spontaneous. You can take 2 solitary bees and put them in a cage in a laboratory and offer them one nest and force them to occupy that one nest, and you will spontaneously see division of labor occur. More times than not, one of them will assume egg-laying responsibilities and one of them will assume subordinate activities. It's like it's spontaneous, just wired in to the order Hymenoptera. So this is an example where new information can occur in biology, not just through evolution, but also through emergent properties. Now what this means in the Hymenoptera nest is a potential disagreement. The workers, that generation 2, they're going to look at their siblings and say, you know what, I got 3 times more of my genes in common with my sister than I do that worthless brother of mine. And so workers are going to be predicted to rear a sex ratio 3-to-1 in favor of females. There is a bias among workers to raise more sisters than brothers, exactly at a rate of 3-to-1. And this is not only predictable, you can show it in the field. They do this. This is very predictable. It flows straight from genetic fitness. And you can show this over and over. The queen, for her part, she's totally content to just raise 50-50. Either egg, male, female, I don't care. Either egg I lay is 50%, says the queen, whereas workers have this bias. Now, why does this matter? This explains the overwhelming sex bias in modern honeybee colonies. The vast majority of individuals in the nest are in fact female. Because even though we have this competition going on between the queen and the workers win just by brute numbers. And they build the comb. They build the comb, which is probably the most direct way of influencing sex ratio. If all you make is 90% worker cells, then, well, guess what, Mom? You're going to be, making mostly female eggs. So this is an example of a built-in conflict and how it has been resolved. But the result for us today is the vast majority of insects are female in the nest, and the vast majority of cells are worker cells. Then we talked about the great change that happens once polyandry. We got a question here? Yeah.
How does she know what type of egg to lay?
How does she know? The question is, how does a female, or a queen in this case, know which egg to lay? She can tell by the dimensions of the cell, which means that the workers kind of call the shots. The workers are kind of calling. This is an example of them winning this competition. They like making more females, and they're the ones that make the brood cells.
Does that mean if there's the more females that you produce, the less work you have to do as a female?
If you do more workers, the question. No, I don't think so. moving on. Okay, remember this picture we talked about this morning? The saxophone music playing and the queens beginning to practice polyandry. This is truly one of those great moments in evolution. I was speaking last week. I love this cartoon. I was speaking 2 weeks ago in Illinois at the Illinois State, and I was describing this cartoon. And if you ever mention Gary Larson and The Far Side, you always get people laughing in the room. And I was describing, that cartoon? It's these goofy little animals down in the water on the beach, and they're looking up on the beach, and they're holding a baseball bat, and there's a baseball up on the beach, and it's called Great Moments in Evolution. And she's out there. You mean this one? She said, yes, and she mailed it to me. So there it is. But this moment of polyandry was truly one of those great moments in evolution. Because at this moment, then, the queens and the workers had diverged to the point that they were no longer autonomous. Each was mutually dependent on the other, at which point we now have a new level of biological organization, the superorganism, which is now selected for or against in normal Darwinian fashions. And this is a step that we humans have not taken. It may not even be in our lineage, but it's been very adaptive for the Hymenopterans because of this relatedness bias that occurs. That 75% super sister thing was a huge incentive to go the social route that's just simply not available to us, because we're diploid through and through. Guys and gals, we're common on that count. So with the emergence of polyandry came all of the other benefits of complex social living, the large colonies that we have today. We still have those simple little colonies I'm talking about, where the females mate with only one male and all the daughters are super sisters of each other, and you see them overwhelmingly in the sweat bees. you know, little guys that come around and drink your sweat. That group of bees is very heavily represented by these simple little colonies where they are, you know, these super sisters. What happens now, though? If the mother is practicing polyandry, then you no longer have that neat and tidy little 75% relationship going on anymore. It's like the workers have they just figured it out. It's like, oops, what did we let mom get away with? Because the relationship now looks really bad. It looks like this. Now again, I'm not going to go into it. But the point, there's a couple things here I want to zero in on just to let you see what has happened once the mother has started practicing multiple mating. She's got in her spermatheca the sperm of, on average, 12 to 20 different males, which means that they're no longer all super sisters in one nest. Some of them are super sisters, but the majority of them are sub-sisters with whom I share only 25% of my genes in common. Yeah, here's my occasional super sister, but the majority of the rest of the workers that I rub shoulders with every day are now 25% related to me. I've been ripped off. Wait, abort mission. I don't want to go this way. This is a big rip-off for workers, and it's true. Workers get ripped off. This is a bad deal for workers. They lose. They have suddenly taken a huge hit in the genetic stakes of this game. All of their labors are now contributing to, on average, about 30% of gene propagation instead of 75% like it used to be. So this is a bad deal for the workers, but it's a great deal for the colony. So you see what's happened? There's just been a shift, a sea change in the focus. The spotlight of natural selection has shifted away from the individuals to the group. And it's now the group that is getting more and more complex, more and more involved, more and more behaviors, more and more intricacies, more and more fit, more and more size, more and more food supplies, more and more buffering against all of the hazards that the habitat can throw at it, more and more survivability. So it's been a working strategy, even though the workers took a big hit. It's comparable to our cells. You know, I can imagine my liver saying, you know, I'm really pissed that I can't reproduce. Yeah, I wish I was like the testes. I wish I could reproduce like them, but you know, can't you just imagine that fight going on? What about your lung? Oh, I wish I could reproduce. You know, I can only reproduce as a part of this organism that I belong to. It's that same kind of subordination that has happened at the organismal level. We're just not as aware of it because it's us. But this is the state of affairs now in the relationships of the colonies once the mother begins practicing polyandry. Now, any given worker can still cheat. In fact, she now has even more incentive to cheat and try to produce her own son. Because you know what, Mom? You ripped me off, and your polyandry now means I'm working for 30% of the wages when I used to have 75% of the wages. Well, I'm going to show you. I'm just going to go off and lay some eggs. And they do. And we've already talked about how the queen insidiously keeps that under control. She not only eats their eggs, she now has pheromones to double her efficacy. But the workers are always primed to go back to this instead of this. They can double their reproductive output if they can cheat and get away with it and produce an occasional male. Now you as a beekeeper witness this anytime you have a colony go queenless. How long does it take when a colony goes queenless for some of the workers' ovaries to develop? And this is what you're seeing here. This is some worker ovaries, look like the letter Y. And if you compare those ovaries to the ovaries of a queen, I mean, it's night and day. The queens are very swollen and huge and lots of eggs in the production pipeline, whereas these workers' ovaries are pathetic. But once that queen's pheromone is removed, those ovaries begin to develop, and within a matter of days, you will have workers producing eggs. And this is what you see, the occasional egg that gets turned into a male because it's a worker that did it. And here's another interesting thing about laying workers. Once a colony goes laying worker, they not only activate their ovaries, but they behaviorally shut off any working behavior. They stop foraging for the welfare of the colony. They stop feeding the brood. They stop cleaning the nest. They're working only for their own selfish interests. It really is selfish expression. And they're always primed and ready to do this at a moment's notice. And we see this as beekeepers when we have colonies go queenless.
But only a small percentage are able to, right?
The question is, only a small percentage are able to. That percentage jumps dramatically once the queen pheromone is gone. You'll get on average about 50% of them doing it. There is a small percentage that can actually dodge the queen's pheromones altogether and occasionally lay eggs, and in fact I'm going to talk about that. Okay, this is what we see, you know, the symptom of laying workers. They really are bad at laying eggs. They're very unpracticed at it. They're phylogenetically very distant from that ancient maternal behavior, so they've sort of lost the tricks. They'll lay 2 eggs on top of each other. Invariably, this is a lethal situation. They just don't survive if there's 2 of them in there. And even if they lay them, chances aren't good that anybody's going to even feed them. Because everybody, I just want to lay eggs. That's all I want to do. I don't want to feed anything. I just want to lay eggs. You feed them. I don't want to feed them. You feed them. It's you know, social order just begins dissolving at this point. Now, I want to pause here and make another analogy that I think will kind of, well, I know it will. I know it'll resonate with all of us. What I've just talked about with the honeybee is not unique to the honeybee. It's true to every level of biological organization. The lower levels are always primed and ready to rebel. The same problems have popped up at every one of those stages of the biological hierarchy. And at every one of those stages, there have been checks and balances put into place to keep those lower units in line. I've talked about what they are in the honeybee colony, and it's that rebellion when a lower level says, you know what, I want to reproduce anyway. I don't care about the genome to which I'm attached. I want to reproduce anyway. And we call that a laying worker. Or we may call it, here in a few minutes, queens that fight to the death. But in organisms like you and me, we call it cancer. And that is in principle indecipherable. It's identical to what I'm talking about here. Cancer is the same at every level of biological organization, and that is the lower units rebelling against the higher units. And remember, each one of those stages is provisional. It is always provisional on checks placed on the lower levels. And if those checks fall apart, then those lower levels are always going to rebel and be ready and poised in a state of mutiny. I'm not a human physiologist or physician, but there's checks and balances in our bodies that keep that in place. One of the things is that we go through a single cell bottleneck. In sexual reproduction with diploid animals like you and me, you go through that zygote stage where you have the egg fertilized by a sperm, and at that moment, boing, you've got that zygote now begins splitting into 2, and then into 4, and then into 8, and then into 16, you know, geometrically bigger and bigger, but every one of those cells is clones of one another. So that's how organisms answer that problem. Plus there's other immune functions that our bodies have evolved to keep those lower levels in check. But any time that those checks and balances are compromised, whether through environment, whether through age, those checks and balances dissolve, and we too are prone to cancer. And it's the exact same principle in the superorganism. In fact, the honeybee illustrates it for us. We as beekeepers have a very unique insight into that process, which is in fact a universal process across all of biological structure. You know, we've all had this personally, haven't we? I mean, every single one of us in this room, so this is hitting close to home. But this also points to one of the, why cancer is so recalcitrant, why it is so resistant. It is not an alien thing imposed on us from outside of us. It is not like catching a pathogen. Oh, I caught some bug. No, it's not. Cancer is woven into our structure of our bodies in a deep and profound way. And that's why it's so difficult to treat. I got to couch myself when I say this, because I had a lady really upset a couple weeks ago, and she came up to me and said, are you saying we'll never will never answer, will never solve cancer. No. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am trying to illuminate is how integral it is to our body's structure and our evolution. It's not accident. It's integral to our evolution, our lower levels refusing to be subsumed anymore. Ultimately, like Richard Dawkins teaches us in his book, The Selfish Gene, the gene is the fundamental and ultimate unit. However, it gets divided up into cells or chromosomes or organisms or multicellular organisms or soup, blah, 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 blah. Whatever level it finds itself, it is ultimately the gene that is the selfish carrier, and we are just the carriers of that gene. Ultimately, the gene is selfish, but it's equally true that by lumping with other levels and cooperating, genes have a better chance of making it in the long run. So it's a curious tension between selfishness and cooperation has been the history of life on this planet. But cooperation is at least as important as selfishness. Okay, so what comes next? We've talked about the organism, the superorganism, the uberorganism. I don't know. I kind of doubt it. We have some hints what's going on over in Africa. There is one of the races of honeybee that I didn't even mention this morning called Apis mellifera capensis, and it's named after the Cape of South Africa. This is one bad boy. This is one bad girl, shall we say. Because this worker is capable of reproducing without fertilization and rearing fertile eggs that turn into females. It's a process called parthenogenesis. And we don't really know why. There's really only been one authoritative opinion that's been published on this, and this is Robin Crew, who's at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And Robin Crew, incidentally, is on my docket for next year's Young Harris Institute. Those of you who know Lance Wilson, Lance has been a regular at my institute for, good Lord, years on end now. And everything he said good about it is true. So you really should come to the Young Harris Institute, and for this next year we have Robin Crew coming, and he's going to be talking about this issue with the Cape bee in South Africa. Robin's hypothesis is that the Cape is extremely windy, and queens on their mating flights are lost at a horrific rate. And he believes that the Cape bee evolved this ability of parthenogenesis for workers to kind of pick up the slack. So what you have, you can imagine this happening here. Your queen flies on her mating flight. She's blown out to sea, and the workers, no problem, we'll just rear up our ovaries and raise female eggs, which they do, and they kind of limp along for a while until conditions are right again, and then they'll rear one of them into a queen, because queens at the end of the day are still better egg layers, and she'll fly and oh good, she made it, and she'll come back, and then the colony revs back up into a queen-right phase again. So they cycle in and out. They cycle in and out of queenless, queen-right, queenless, queen-right, and they just never go ahead and die. And it's probably a survival method for these horrific rates of queen loss due to windy conditions off the Cape. Okay, well that's so far so good. But then in the 1990s, a new problem surfaced when commercial beekeepers in northern South Africa began trucking Apis mellifera scutellata, which is the African bee that we know in this world, trucking them down to do pollination and honey in southern Africa, and they encountered the native range of the Cape bee, and the Cape bee showed its colors, shall we say, as a social parasite. The Cape bees can enter other colonies, kill those queens, and take over their normal Cape bee behavior, which means reverting to this queenless stage where the workers are laying female eggs, and after a while they'll raise a Cape queen, and they have now socially parasitized and taken over their host. What do you do? What do you do? Which one of them is the Cape worker? Which one should I kill? Oh wait, there's 100 of them. Oh, what am I going to do? And the colonies, they never just go ahead and properly die. They're just as bad and worthless as any of our worker bees or queenless laying worker colonies, except that they don't die. They just keep limping along. So this is a big problem in South Africa. We do not want this bee in this country.
And you can't keep making it more queen-right?
You cannot, no, the question is, can you requeen them? And the answer is no. They just refuse to accept alien bees.
Well, I don't mean with an alien queen, but with a good mated queen.
Well, a
Good
queen,
mated queen.
oh, a good cape one. Well, the trouble is they all phase in and out.
Yeah.
So they're just not a good practical bee to keep. So people always ask me, they say, well, you know, what's next? And I got to say, there's nothing in the literature, even in other systems, there's really nothing else to suggest that there's anything higher than the superorganism. It seems to be kind of the last stable level of organization. And even the superorganism is not as stable as the organism. We are more stable than superorganisms because our body cells are clones. And so we have a much greater harmony within our genome than a superorganism does. But beyond a superorganism, it seems to just be pure parasitism. Parasitism. And this gives us an indication of what that might look like. Yeah, take a look at some of the possibilities in a cape colony. Remember, they're clonal. They produce by clones. So here you have a cape queen. She produces a daughter with whom she's 50% related, but that daughter parthenogenically produces a clone. See, this number is 100%, genetically identical to her daughter. So there's this huge incentive for them to rear parthenogenic eggs. And in the cape bee, they don't parasitize one another. They are content to stay in their own colonies, and so they cycle in and out. But you enter another race, and they become parasites. Pretty heady stuff, huh? Okay, let's think a little bit now about other things that can go wrong in the colony. And this is an important point that I probably don't make often enough, that evolution is not perfection. Evolution is optimization. It makes the best out of a set of situations. And here's an example of that. From the colony's point of view, from the fitness of the colony, it would be far better for Apis mellifera to do what the ants and the termites do, and that is to practice polygyny. Okay, I've talked about polyandry. Well, now I'm talking about polygyny, which is multiple females. And you will find in termites and in ants, many of these species have multiple queens. And it's in the ants and the termites that we get the truly breathtaking social strata of social insects. Colony populations in the millions. Colonies measured in square acres in size. And this is where we get some of the extraordinary behaviors in the animal kingdom, like slave making. You know, we have slave-making ants that enslave other species of ants. We have farming termites and ants that raise fungi to feed upon. And all of these behaviors really make the honeybee look rather simple at the end of the day. But this is what normally happens in the honeybee colony instead. We have a female, it's swarming season typically, who is selected and fed copiously with royal jelly. Swarming season is usually when this automatically happens. You know, reproduction of the superorganism is always and necessarily tied to queen rearing as well. And then we have something that looks like this. This picture, by the way, is a great master beekeeper question. You know, describe what's happening here. Well, here we have a queen cell that's emerged from the tip, which tells us that she was a normal emergence. But these that are opened at the side tell us that she went down the row and killed her rival sisters. She broaches no competition. And this is pure selfishness, pure, absolute, unbridled selfishness. The colony would do better if it had two queens, but this is an example of a type of cancer, a sub-optimization. Now, we as beekeepers have the benefit of being able to physically measure the evolutionary cost to the queen's selfishness. And you can do this with the double queen rearing system. Let's say you have a strong colony coming out of winter, and if you don't intercede, it most certainly will swarm. Well, what can you do? You can take a new queen and about a third of the brood and put them up here in a split, keep the old queen and the rest of the brood down here, separate them with a couple honey supers, and give them a double screen, which is just that. It's a double screen with an independent entrance. So you essentially now have two independent colonies living under one roof. And what you get is a really, really abnormally large worker population. And if you time it right so that the beginning of your nectar flow coincides with the emergence of brood and your new queen, then you can go in there and salvage one of the queens if you want to, because otherwise they will kill each other. So remove one of the queens and use her somewhere else. Take away the double screen, and you will now have unbridled honey storage under one roof with a really huge population that probably did not swarm and had the output of 2 queens instead of 1. And I did this when I was a kid growing up as a teenager, and it really worked. I mean, I got ginormous honey crops, but I quit because it was too much work. And I literally had to carry a stepladder with me. And here I was teetering up this stepladder to take off super. And I was like, this is not fun anymore. So that's the reason why I quit. But it's a very direct and simple way for any of us to look at an example of imperfect evolution. This is something what is from the species point of view, is suboptimal. Okay, I want to tell you about one more thing that's kind of mind-bendy. And this is it's not really a new paper anymore. It came out in 2005, but I think it's gotten not enough attention because what he's suggesting is really bizarro. This is Robin Moritz. He's recently retired, but he runs one of the big bee units in Germany. And they found evidence of what they're calling rare royal subfamilies. And it works like this. When the queen is laying the eggs in swarming season, she has some control over what becomes the next queen. And she does this by depositing her eggs in a queen cup, those structures, on the comb. And we know that statistically those cups are biased in favor of becoming a queen, that the workers will agree with their mother and go ahead and rear those cups into queens. So the mother has a little bit of control over her successor. But what about if the colony swarms a second time? Or let's imagine a supersedure, when the workers make the decision. Okay, the queen wasn't necessarily laying eggs in a cup. She got accidentally mashed by the beekeeper, and it wasn't swarming season. Well, what do the workers now do? The workers are choosing the next queen. And in these scenarios, Robin Moritz was able to show that the workers overwhelmingly chose just one subfamily in their nest to become the next queen. And they had nothing to do with kinship. Okay, it was not my super sister, but there's this larva out there that says, "Raise me! Hey, you up there, nursery, feed me royal jelly. Don't feed him, feed me. I'm the good one." So these larvae, and they actually were able to show that they actually elicit pheromone cues that cause nurses to preferentially take care of them and rear them into queens. Now that's cool. But the flip side of the coin is even weirder. That subfamily, the very same subfamily, is virtually absent from the workers. They do not rear them into workers. They only rear them into queens. Or conversely, the worker form of that subfamily is lethal and doesn't emerge. We don't know yet which of those explains it, but this subfamily does not occur among the workers.
So the queen laid the egg, and now she's gone. They decided to make it into a queen.
Yeah.
And now it's a queen.
Yes.
If that baby is stuck in there and the queen stays and she's born?
It has to, the reason there's a bias in favor of the queen is because the queen lays eggs in cups. She also lays them not in cups, but she does a lot in cups. And that makes a statistical bias for her to choose the next queen because she's laying eggs in cups. But when the workers have unfettered choice, no cups, just I can take whatever queen I want, they overwhelmingly choose these royal patriline's to be the next queen. And they underrepresent them as workers. The hypothesis is that we're seeing here parasitic behavior on par with the Cape bees. That this is a parasitic subfamily in Apis mellifera that is universal to all the subspecies that Robin has looked at so far, including ours, Ligustica and Mellifera and Carnica. And if that is so, then this seems to be like yet that one more step in, okay, what's after the superorganism? Parasitism is what's after the superorganism. These are subfamilies that are saying, I want to reproduce, I don't want to even make workers, I just want to reproduce. And they're getting really good at having workers of a colony rear them, and they don't make a worker caste. And that is the definition of a social parasite. We have cuckoo bumblebees that do this. They enter nests, kill the queen, rear their own eggs, and dupe the resident colony into raising their own offspring. Now, traditionally, we have always said that supersedure cells are bad cells because they're not reared during a swarm impulse. But now we have this hypothesis to consider, that they may in fact be parasitic. And this makes a strong argument for us to not use queens reared in supersedure situations.
So you're saying that the queen who is then born from this specific subfamily won't be a good queen?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for hitting that nail. Yes. So what we would predict, if what Robin is saying is true, we would predict that supersedure queens are propagating parasitic behavior. The propagation of females who are biased into being made into queens, but not made into workers. And we see this with the poor performance of supersedure queens. They don't make as many workers. They don't have as strong a colony. And this is an alternate explanation to the old classical explanation that was just purely nutrition. All right, let me wrap up my main points here today. Keep in mind that at all levels of biological organization, the lower units are always poised for mutiny. And in workers, honeybees, we call that laying workers. In organisms like you and me, we call that cancer. But the principle is indistinguishable. It is the same principle at work. Queens and workers disagree on sex ratio. And what we have today, this modern bias toward female workers, is because workers have won just by sheer biomass. And they're the ones who build the combs. So take that, Mom. You know, if you're going to practice polyandry, we'll get back even at you the only way we can. Queens don't tolerate rivals, even to the detriment of the colony. It would be better if they did. It raises the question, if the only option higher than the superorganism is parasitism, that does in fact seem to be the case, and it doesn't look pretty. And we don't want the Cape bee in this country. And our latest research suggests that supersedure queens may in fact be an insidious form of social parasitism, giving us another reason to try to stick with queens that are reared in a swarm impulse. Incidentally, this very last bullet is a strong argument in favor of the classical Doolittle queen rearing method. This is one of those rare points where a human grafted queen is superior to a supersedure. Because we're blind. Here we are, we're grafting away. You know, we're totally oblivious to which one is parasitic or not. So getting a grafted Doolittle queen is better than a supersedure. Cool, huh? We can sometimes make things right. We don't always know. Yeah. Okay, well, that's the end of my prepared comments. I think I'm out of time anyway, so thank you for listening.